Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Susan Deutsch. I'm the program manager at the Muse Writers Center. We are a 501c creative writing nonprofit located in Norfolk, Virginia. Oof, got an echo going on. All right, that's cleared up. We're a creative writing nonprofit. We are located in southeastern Virginia, and we offer creative writing classes, events such as this one, and outreach programs to senior, youth, and military. Right now, many of our events and classes are online, so they are open no matter where you are in the world. So be sure to take a peek at the-muse.org. Another exciting thing is that all of our youth classes this semester, we are offering completely free of charge. We always have tuition assistance available for all of our classes, but this semester for our youth classes, you don't even need to apply for tuition assistance. It is automatically applied. So if you have any creative teens in your life, be sure to direct them our way. Now, our program this evening, we will have two wonderful poets reading who I'm so happy to have with us. All the work they're reading here tonight is their own work unless otherwise stated, and this is in no means a publication of unpublished work. So I'm going to go ahead and switch us so you can see our wonderful poets tonight. So I'll go ahead and introduce them. Kashiana Singh is from India, lives in North Carolina, and carries her various geographical homes within her poetry. She is a management professional by definition, but a work or poet practitioner by personal preference. She proudly serves as a managing editor for Poets Reading the News, and her voice can be read and heard on various international platforms. Her debut collection of poetry, Shelling Peanuts and Stringing Words, was released in January 2019, and her chapbook Crushed Anthills was published in 2020. Now, Kashiana's latest full-length collection, Woman by the Door, was published this year, 2022, by Apprentice House Press. And I will let her tell you more about this as we get underway. Our second poet tonight is Joan Kwon Glass, whose work explores trauma, grief, memory, motherhood, and recovery. She is a mixed-race Korean American who grew up in Michigan and South Korea. Joan is the author of Night Swim, which is the winner of the 2021 Diode Editions book contest, and several chapbooks including Bloodline, How to Make Pancakes for a Dead Boy, and If Rust Can Grow on the Moon, which came out from Milk and Cake Press this year in 2022. Since 2018, Joan's poems have been nominated multiple times for the Pushcart Prize and for Best of the Net. She serves as Poet Laureate for the city of Milford, Connecticut, Poetry Co-Editor for West Trestle Review, and Poetry Reader at Rogue Agent. Kashiana and Joan, it is so wonderful to have you with us tonight. So happy to have you. I know you have some things in mind. You'd like to read us some of your work, which I'm so excited for. And also, I know you have some things you want to talk about. But for anyone who is watching live, if you're in the Zoom webinar and you have a question, go ahead and put it in the Q&A section. If you look down at the bottom, it is to the left of the chat box. So if you have a question for Joan or Kashiana, go ahead and pop it in there at any point. And if you're watching live on Facebook, you can just go ahead and leave a comment on the video. And now I will hand it over to Kashiana and Joan if you'd like to go ahead and share with us. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, Susan, and thank you to the Muse Writers Center. I am so excited to be sharing this space with Joan, especially her work, everything that you said, Susan, but if you've read her work and if you haven't, please go pick up her books. I have one of them sitting right here next to me that we're going to read from today. Her work is stunning. And Joan, by the way, congratulations. I know you got a finalist in another sundress contest recently. So super exciting. And of course, there's no question that your work's stunning and outstanding. Very excited, look forward to the reading. We'll share a little more. There's a little surprise in how we are going to do this reading today, a little different from what you may be used to, but I'll hand over to Joan for a second and then we can go from there.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our reading. We were just talking before the webinar began about how there may be a little bit of Zoom fatigue. So it's really greatly appreciated that you're here. I happen to think that Zoom is just a beautiful tool. It was like, one of the few gifts of the pandemic. And I'm just extremely grateful also to be sharing the space with Kashiana, who invited me to read with her. And anytime I get an invitation to read with someone, I'm always stunned, that someone wants to read with me. And I'm just very honored and very grateful. And I also have a copy, which was by my nightstand, of Woman by the Door, which is Kashiana's latest book. I've almost finished it. I'm about 3/4 of the way through. And if you haven't gotten a copy, you definitely should. It's available at Apprentice House Press.
Thank you. All right. So maybe, Joan, we can start by sharing just a little bit of how we are going about the readings, and then we can jump into our readings and get into some Q&A with each other. Does that sound like a plan?
Sure.
Yeah. So for everybody who's on, and we were talking with Susan earlier, is we are doing this a little differently, meaning what Joan and I did was to pick each other's favorite poems from our respective books. So we are definitely going to be reading the poems that Joan chose for me and I chose for her. However, we might read some of our own favorites too, depending on how time goes. And then I am sure I took permission. I hope I'll do justice to read one of Joan's actually from her book, and we'll go along like that. And then again, happy to have questions, throw them in the chat, like Susan said, and we'll watch for the questions and come to it towards the latter half of the discussion, as well as we have some questions for each other, which of course we want to understand each other's work, where we come from, our process, etc. Right, Joan, would you add anything?
I think that sounds great. We talked, Kashiana and I had a chance to speak on the phone prior to this reading. And one of the very first things that we said to one another is just how different our styles are, and how much we appreciated each other's poetry. We also talked about the fact that memory is a common theme, but the way that we approach discussing memory in the poems was just so different. And it was, it's just really cool. Like, poetry is so cool and so weird,
Yeah.
It really is. I just enjoyed your book so much. I'm amazed by just the different styles that people have, and how I could never write the way that you do, and I feel that about other poets too, that I just admire their work so much and am always so amazed by how different our poems can be, but really sometimes accomplishing the same things.
Right. And we'll get to some of that discussion. And likewise, like I said, memory, grief, loss, how does poetry serve as catharsis? And we've got to talk about that a little bit, that the end result or the end outcome may be catharsis, but how we go about it and how we approach it may be different, whether it's picking the subject or the content, as well as the form, style, and manner in which we go about it. So we'll both be probably reading some of poems that touch these themes and go deeper into that. Maybe we should jump into the reading actually. Joan, do you want to take the first pass and start with yours, or would you like me to start?
I'm happy to do it either way.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Why don't you jump in?
Okay. So I'm going to share just the images of both of my books. This book is called How to Make Pancakes for a Dead Boy, and it's the winner of the Marginalia contest at Harbor Editions. I'm going to be reading poems from this book. However, Night Swim, which is my first full-length poetry collection, is available for pre-order right now and available for instant purchase on March 23rd. I'm also able to mail copies if someone wanted a signed copy. So,
yeah. And if I can jump in, get a signed copy, people. I have a signed copy here of this.
Oh, you're
book.
so awesome.
It's so beautiful.
Thank you. So as we said, we are going to be reading some of the Some of the poems that we kind of chose for each other, at least I'm going to read all, I think I'm going to start with two or no, actually I'll read three. And then there was one that Kashiana was interested in reading for me. And I found your choices just really, really interesting. The first poem that I'm going to read, I should just give a disclaimer, although I think probably most people here know that my poetry focuses on loss, on trauma, specifically on loss to suicide, and also on the survival of losing family members to suicide. So they're very difficult poems to read, to hear, and I appreciate, I appreciate your willingness to listen. This first poem is called Line, and I actually wrote it in the shape of, I don't know if you can see that, but in the shape of kind of like a winding line. This poem is in reference to my nephew's wake and the line of people that went outside the funeral parlor and down the street. And I apologize, I'm just getting over a cold, so if my voice sounds a little weird, that's why. Here's Line. At the wake, my nephew's schoolmates line up to pay their respects. Some of them crying, others terrified, holding on to their parents as though they might catch death by getting too close to his body, might drown by standing too near his casket the color of night sea and silver stars, his stilled body a full moon. They stretch down the length of the funeral home's burnt coral carpet and wind around the French doors. The funeral director holds open the front door, and the line continues onto the sidewalk, down past the Tim Hortons, stretches out in front of the strip mall and behind the dumpsters, down past the highway and into the neighborhoods. So many children, it is easy to lose count. The line is a Bible verse from Revelations I am forced to recite in front of the entire church. A lake appears behind a house on a hill, and they fidget, loosen their ties. The girl he almost kissed at his first dance finds herself standing on a dock. Behind her, his schoolmates tread water, their faces bob up and down, resigned, disappear below the surface. Each child holds on to another's leg, pulls him down, down. When his teacher gets to the front of the line, she says, "He was just too good for this world." I greet each child, hug their tender bodies that bend so easily in my arms. I tell them how brave they are to say goodbye.
That's just beautiful. Such a beautiful poem. Such a beautiful.
That poem, Kashiana, was really, it was, I'm not sure where it came from, but it was a very surreal poem to write because I remember at the wake feeling like, is this line ever going to end? And I started to envision it moving backwards. And then much later, years later, I wrote this poem. So it's a connection to that moment. The next poem that Kashiana,
before you jump to your next poem, while you were reading, I pulled up, and I will probably start with that. It's from Shelling Peanuts and Stringing Words. It's my first book. I wasn't initially planning to read from that, but I have to, listening to you reading lines.
Wonderful.
And this one's called checklists, advanced planning services for funerals. So we'll go there and we can then talk a little more about it. But go ahead. I just wanted to make that connection with you.
Thank you. I look forward to that. I can't wait to hear you read. This next poem is the title poem, How to Make Pancakes for a Dead Boy. And this is the first poem that I ever wrote about my nephew after his passing. How to make pancakes for a dead boy. First, crack the egg into a sinkhole of grief. Measure the ingredients, then stir the lumps until they no longer resemble bullets. Try not to see him standing at your side at age 6, front teeth missing, pulling on your sleeve to whisper with a grin, "Auntie, please add extra chocolate chips." Run the electric beaters until you can no longer hear his voice as a toddler or the snap and boom of his first and last shot. Pour the batter onto the griddle. While the pancakes rise, read his suicide note again. Try to make sense of it and get nowhere. Cut the pancakes into bite-sized pieces. Sweeten the plate as you scream. That's always a hard one for me to read.
Thank you for reading it.
The last poem that I'm going to read from How to Make Pancakes for a Dead Boy is called Nocturne for Lost Sons. And I wrote this, actually, I have a binders writing group that meets on Mondays. It's a small group, and I haven't been to it in a while because I haven't been writing for a while. But we read a poem called Girls Are Coming Out of the Woods by Tishani Doshi. And I absolutely fell in love with this poem. And I ended up writing a nocturne after the poem called Nocturne for Lost Sons.
It's funny, Joan. See, the second book I have at my door is A God at the Door, which is Tishani's latest book.
I don't have it yet, but it's in my cart. It's in my cart.
It's a beautiful book. You have to get that. Yes.
She's amazing. Okay. Nocturne for Lost Sons. Can you see them? The boys coming home in the dark. They rise hungry from rivers and coffins. We find them barefoot on train tracks, hidden on ferries, wearing Halloween costumes or high school tracksuits, bullet casings or pills sputtering from their ears and pockets, wounds pulsing with butterflies and soil, lips stitched shut. They follow porch lights like stars as they crawl, dragging umbilical cords or rope or teddy bears behind them, pelvic bones inching forward on bellies of air, babies who wouldn't latch, starved boys, the ones who found the world unworthy, left notes with messages like, "You're better off without me." We wait for them outside the city on piers, on porches, hold their dinner plates still warm. If they arrive, we will unthread their lips and nurse them, or lay forkfuls of lasagna on their tongues. We'll tell them their rooms are just as they left them. When dawn comes, all of it will burn away. We hold on as long as we can, hoping the last sound we hear will be of their sneakered feet coming toward us, dribbling balls or pedaling bicycles from wherever they've been. We hold on, desperate to hear them say one last time, "Ma, what's for dinner?" Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for reading those. They are beautiful poems. Every one of them is beautiful, but one had to choose, and those are definitely a few of my favorites. Joan, with your permission, I'm going to start with yours to keep the flow. And I hope I do it justice. Forgive me if I don't.
I'm sure that you will. Thank you. And I wanted to say about this poem very quickly, if you're doing questions for my mother.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I hate this poem and I love this poem because I feel badly that I wrote it. You know, I love I love my mother. I have gotten to a much different place in my grieving process than I was when I wrote it. But this was definitely in the stage of anger.
Yeah.
And I had to go through that to get to where I am now. So I just wanted to give that as a little explanation before you start.
Thank you. It spoke to me. So I'll jump in. Questions for my mother, and this is from Joan's stunning book, How to Make Pancakes for a Dead Boy. I want to ask, when he questioned you about heaven, why did you choose angels? You could have pointed to the tulips opening. Why didn't you call for help as soon as you heard the gunshot? I mean, how can a gunshot in the next room sound like anything other than a gunshot? What if we'd written his obituary to say who he might have been and listed those who failed him, instead of naming his survivors? How can you still spend every Sunday reading those stories about men who give up their firstborn to prove their love for a God who will not intervene? Instead, I ask, why do you keep buying orange juice for my children when it has so much sugar? Their adult teeth have grown in already. They still have their whole lives ahead of them. Questions for my mother.
Oh my gosh, that was so amazing. Listening to you read that, I felt I got very warm. Listening to that was beautiful.
Thank you for letting me read it. I am going to go to, before I jump into your poems, your selected poems from Woman by the Door, I'm going to read this poem from my first book, which is Shelling Peanuts and Stringing Words, and the poem is called Checklists, Advanced Planning Services for Funerals. The context is, again, we said we both have poems coming from a place of loss and grief, and I lost my brother at a very young age, and some of the poems keep drawing from there. This one specifically, in terms of the physicality, we were driving down the road and there was a funeral home which was lighted up, and the sign that said was planning services for funerals. And that's how the poem came about. Checklists, advanced planning services for funerals, blinked the signboard as if apologizing for its own presence. Casket and flowers, check. Obituary and a tombstone, check. Wine and music, check. Prayers and a rabbi, check. A guest book, maybe. Photographs, beyond budget. I walked in, the ghostly white lady at the front desk smiled, skirting my glance. Do you have a survivor's guide? Does it explain the process of saying the last goodbye? Have a coaching class for someone who has not been able to bid goodbye? At least not in an authentic, honest way? She looked at me and said, "Sorry." I walked out and back beyond the blinking lights. Is there even a need to say goodbye? As per the funeral code of conduct, is the survivor's checklist violated if one chooses not to?
Wow, can you read that last
Yes.
line or two just
Yes.
one more time? Because I wasn't
Yes.
expecting that.
Yes.
I just need to hear it again.
Yes, I'll go there. Who has not been able to at least not in an authentic, honest way, she looked at me and said, "Sorry." I walked out and back beyond the blinking lights. Is there even a need to say goodbye as per the funeral code of conduct? Is the survivor's checklist violated if one chooses not to? Thank you.
I love that poem. And I'm so glad that you read that. I feel very connected to, I feel like the poem line and that poem are like sisters.
Yes, Joan, that's how I felt. And so you see, that was my reason for picking lines. And at that time, I didn't mean to pick my poem. But when I heard you reading it, I'm like, it seems like yes, what you said, right? Like they're sisters.
And also a little bit questions for my mother,
right.
Too, because
Yes.
you incorporated questions. And I love poems that ask questions that don't have answers. Mm-hmm. I feel like that's what poems should be. They should be questions that don't necessarily have answers.
Have an answer, right? I always say poetry is a problem-solving tool for me. And however, that does not mean it should solve the problem. It's the process of going through the problem-solving tool that it should serve its purpose, to your point, right?
Love that.
Writing the questions. I'll jump into the poems you chose from Woman by the Door. And I was sharing with my somebody this afternoon, Joan, as I was getting ready for this, and said, you know, all of us have some of the favorite ones we always pick and read. And one of them is something I have read. The two I have never read earlier, read out loud. So this is the first time I'm going to read it.
Wow. Okay. And I think if we have time, I have one of yours I'd like to read. Perfect.
Yes. And so I'll jump in and I'm going to start with just this book. Before I go in, this book is divided into 3 sections, and it's apertures, portal, and detours. Apertures, like Joan said, is a lot of memory and childhood, and it leans into moments from there. Portals is about growth and transition, and the book was born out of the last 10 years, which is when I moved to the US. So it's a crystallization of work that's got written in that period, not about that period. Like we just said, there are poems about grief, but we'll come to the catharsis discussion. Distance, whether it's physical distance from the place or the people, offers you an ability to write differently. So some of the poems happened that way. And then the last section is detours, which goes into grief and loss and some others. And there's some political poems and some pandemic poems in there, but broadly, those are the 3 themes. So I also like, Joan, I don't know if it was intentional, your poems kind of touch all 3 sections as well.
I did not do that on purpose, but I think it makes sense because I tried to choose poems that I felt were core poems for me in the book. So it makes sense that they would have been from different sections.
Right. Yep. I'm going to start with Emptied Trees, and I'll jump in. It should speak for itself. Emptied trees. That audacity of scrawny-legged birds disappearing as they slumber in emptied trees. All wintered branches, parentless, swaying towards the hierarchy of open-ended skies. Its bluish gray a morning, nimble mirror to the tumulus below a solitary birch disrobing itself onto rows of epitaphs. I turn away my stare to listen to the whit-whit of a perched swallow. It coaxes me to stay inside the nectar of her chorus, surrendering. I close my eyes, holding a half horizon inside. A tree whistles an incantation. Emptied Trees.
I loved that poem. I'm just going to keep saying that probably over and over again as you read, but I loved that poem because I felt the imagery was both stark and ethereal. And it's a very difficult thing to accomplish that.
Thank you.
And there was a line in that poem, something like branches without parents or something like that.
Parentless branches.
Parentless branches. And I just have never heard a phrase like that, but I could see it. I could envision what you meant. So beautiful.
Thank you. When you go through the book, there's I said no context, but the reference to context and why some of these is, I used to walk around a cemetery, and there's a lot that happens that allows in that, and there's actually a poem titled Cemeteries as well towards the end of the book. I'll jump to the next poem, which Joan, you chose, and that's Windows in Rooms. Like I said, the section Portals is a lot about transition. This book is a crystallization of my move from one country to another, from one home to another. But even growing up, my father was in a job that had us move cities. So every 3 or 4 years, we were in a new city. So I'll leave you with that context and then jump into the poem. And the poem is called Windows and Rooms. The windows of all my lived houses are bordered in conversations and accents that lead to more rooms. Like whispers, movements within the solemn air, a sharp snake hissing into stretched crevices. The doors of these houses become dancing altars that keep ghosts outside. Like termite that eats into edges, unfinished stories crawl into their floors. I walk barefoot across an empty courtyard towards a kaleidoscope of cities and secrets. These cities emerge one by one from every unused corner between rooms. Each city a breath transcreated into memories, each memory shuffling through unborn time. They stay. I move through each city, treading on its sidewalks and letting its roofed shadow move with me, disappearing. I gather corners of cities into the fragile folds of my own gravity, creating homes. Tethered to the stillness of bones, my marrow thrashing against all the nights lost inside sleep's charcoal flesh. I decorate a curved alcove with sprayed sediments of my own body. Windows and Rooms.
There are so many lines in that poem that, excuse me, that took me to different places. So I loved the imagery of moving from city to city and walking barefoot across, the sidewalks and the charcoal sky of sleep.
Yeah.
It was I'm always interested in effective surrealistic poems. And I just thought that was a combination of, once again, the stark and the ethereal. You really do that very well. Your poetry is grounding, but then there's also flight in it.
I like how you say that, Joan. I didn't think of it ever like that. And I didn't think of surreal, but this is where perspective helps, right? When it's coming from distance and you're reading everything without knowing me in any way personally, and that makes a huge difference to how you see what's on the page. But thank you. I appreciate that input.
You're welcome.
I'll jump to the third poem that you chose, which is very different, and it's called, second, I'll pull it up here. Grief in a Portly. I usually don't, this book doesn't have any references or words that I've used from my native language. I expect, and my take is, if you're a poet or interested in poetry, you'll go find out for yourself what it should not mean or say in the context. But just to say it, portly is a little pouch that women carry. It's a stringed pouch, like a stringed purse that women carry, is called a portly. The poem is called Grief in a Portly. Breathing in the cold today, I felt your weight on my eyelids. A sullen sky yawns into its horizon, stretching awake as it stares at the robin, her eyes in gridlock with the tinted regret of gods. Starlings meditate inside murmurations, methodical, leaving behind a stilled tale of coaxed departures. I can hear the season turn, shadows fall in patterns of immensities outside. You insisted on leaving behind howls of open exit wounds gathered into portlies of my mother's erased smiles. Grief in a Portly.
So I would like to rename you the Queen of Last Lines, because that final line just, I had like a physical reaction to it, and I read it several times because it's so good.
Thank you.
It brings the entire poem together in a way that, I mean, I don't know how much time you spent writing those last couple of lines, but they're just brilliant.
Thank you. And like Joan, you said, some of these are hard to read, right? Because I have goosebumps as I read those last lines or just read some of these poems. So
yeah,
we can pause. I'm looking at the clock. Maybe we go into a little bit of discussion, and then maybe we read one poem each towards the end to wrap. Does that
sure?
sound right? I'll start with my question for you, right? And
Okay.
we're talking about catharsis. I just shared my thoughts. The reason this poetry serves as catharsis for me is it forces distance. You're unable to write till you actually, I think of the image of you're like hovering above the situation and you can see it from a distance versus in the room where your perspective is subjective. You're watching from here when you're doing a poem, and that allows you to look at your own self and your own body and physical, mental state, as well as others in a different way. And that to me is cathartic, not just in a situation of grief, but even in day-to-day situations. So talk to me. Of course, this is huge for you, Joan. So talk to us about it.
So absolutely catharsis. I don't know that I would choose that word, but there's a reason for that. And the reason is that I often don't even know what I'm feeling when I write something. I've always been like, I was a very serious, quiet child. I've never been very emotive, and writing is how I've often figured out what feeling I'm even having.
That's a great point.
Yeah. So when I write, for example, and I'm writing a poem, I often start with objects or an image, and eventually I'm able to see connections between whatever it is that's coming into the scene for me. And the magic of writing a poem about a difficult memory or a trauma or a loss is that the poetry does the work for you.
That's a great
You know,
point.
the connections that like my poetry brain
Yes.
or my poetry gut, you know, find for me. I'm not capable of doing that in my daily life. I'm
That's a great
very,
point.
you know, I'm very incapable of really even expressing how I feel. I mean, my boyfriend will often ask me like, how are you feeling? Or, you know, how was your day? And I'm like, I don't know. I'll be able to tell you in a week, like how I was feeling that day. You know, and I think that's, I don't think I'm alone in that. I think there
Not
are
at all.
other,
Yep.
yeah, I think a lot of us artists, writers, we know we need to say something or there's something going on internally, but I know for me, I often have no idea what it is.
What the description of it is, right? You cannot, you can't isolate that into as much as we are supposed to be word people, right? You can't put words around what your feeling is till it comes out in the form of a poem. I want to hold on to what you said about just, right, your boyfriend asking you and you saying, or wanting to say, like, maybe I'll tell you a week later. And that though is distance, right? It's distance from that moment and that emotion, and you're able to therefore process that in a different way than when that feeling is still stirring inside you, right?
You're
so that's what I meant
right.
by distance. Yeah.
I'm interested, I think, in how, I mean, you said, when I mentioned this before, you said that you've never really thought of your poems this way, but how do you, I'm just going to ask it because this is the question that I have. What are some ways that you use in your writing process to achieve that effect of the ethereal and the grounding? Because I really think what stood out to me about your poetry is that starkness and that ethereal beauty and how they're juxtaposed and how they play off each other, the contrast, and then the coming together and the divining. And, you know, so I'm just wondering if, you know, or if you aren't able to kind of articulate that, a moment where that happened for you in your writing.
Yeah, yes, I love that you're taking me there, because this is where, right, with these readings are readings, but they're also educational and a learning process, especially when you're doing it with somebody, like we don't work together usually, right? So you learn differently. So thank you. Two-part. One, let me start with the process first, because I know there is something that's happened over the last few years that's causing me and resulting in me doing things differently. And I got introduced to the world of haiku a couple of years ago, and I was a hesitant entrant to it. But I am smitten for life now.
Oh, how cool. I love that.
I don't think I'm anywhere near being able to write haiku. If you read the book, there are many, I wouldn't even dare to call them haiku, because the haiku purists will murder me if I call them haikus, but they're haiku inspired, right?
Okay.
The reason that made a difference, or has made a huge difference, is that process of reduction and the juxtaposition. In those 3 lines and a few syllables that you write, that's the core, right? You kind of juxtapose, you create resonance, and you also have to follow the process of reduction of what you're wanting to say to bring it into those 3 lines.
Right.
So that, from a process perspective and a training perspective, that's helped me. If I go back even to just shelling peanuts and stringing words versus Woman by the Door, I know that process kind of has instilled, it's like exercise, right? It's still instilled a different habit in me of when I'm writing. So let me pause there. That's the process answer. I know that's an answer, and I know it's made a difference to me.
Okay.
From a moment answer, the spiritual, it's funny, right? It was it was for a different reason. I was having a conversation, and I just thought before going in, let me just check how many times have I used the word prayer. And you and I both, as we write, we go check before our final manuscript, right? We check if there's repeat words and things like that. And the prayer word escaped even that editing process, but the word prayer features throughout the book, like maybe 15, 16, 17 times. I am not a religious person, but I'm a person of spiritual faith, at least. I have strong faith in the spirit of gratitude, the spirit of contentment, and the spirit. And I think, so just to say it, I think that somehow seeps in to whatever I may be writing about. And like I said, nobody said this to me in the way you have to today, Joan, or earlier when we spoke. So I don't have a framed answer, but that's my reaction to what you're saying.
Thank you. This is very helpful for me, just thinking about my own processes also, and what I want to write next and how I want to write it. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Before we go, we have probably 10 minutes, but what about your process, Joan? I do want to hear about your process as well.
It's been a very prolific year and a half in my writing life.
Right.
And right now I really haven't written a poem in 6 months, maybe longer. And I find that my process tends to be very intense. So when I'm writing, I am in writing mode. I see poems. I see poems everywhere. Wow. I feel them. I dream about them. Wow. And they just demand to be written. So when I'm in that mode, I usually wake up on the weekends at 4 o'clock before anyone else is awake, because I have 3 children, and I live with my mother and with my boyfriend. So I'll wake up very, very early and spend as much time as I can writing before anyone else wakes up.
That's so interesting. Yep.
Well, my life is, I'm a middle school teacher, a full-time middle school teacher, and a mother, and I have a very busy life. So those early pre-dawn hours are often when I do things for myself. That's when I exercise too.
That's your time, right?
Yeah, 4 o'clock in the morning. So in terms of like when I write, that's when I do my most of my writing. I read. Sometimes if I read a poem that moves me, or like I have an idea that comes to me from that poem, I use the Notes app on my phone for a snippet, or I'll put a page number or something to go back to, so that, because it'll happen sometimes in strange places, but I need to be able to go back to it.
Yes.
So I think that's, other than that, I really don't know. I have friends that I run poems by. I've had the same editor that I've worked with, Lynn Schmidt, who has been the editor on all of my books, and she's absolutely brilliant editor.
Well, let's take a moment and shout out to her, because she's my editor too.
Oh, did I know that?
Maybe we may have messaged. I don't, but I knew that she was your editor too. So big shout out to her. She's awesome.
She is wonderful. She's so talented. And all of the books that she was editor for are published or are going to be published. So I think it's important to have 1, 2, 3 people that you can share your work with who do know you, and you establish a rapport with them and you exchange work and kind of go back and forth, and you have someone to run ideas by and be like a cheerleader.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
both
part of it.
cheerleader and critique, right? Both.
Mhm.
You need both of them. If one leans too heavily, it can have an impact to the writing. You need both. You need a cheerleader and you need a critique as well. I will say the Notes app is my favorite too. I have a little grandson that I'm around all the time these days, and poetry happens when he's in my arms, and poetry will happen when he's doing something, and I think of something, so I capture that moment and then come back to it. So I love that. I'm sure a lot of people do, but it served me well.
What did we do before we had apps on our phones to capture moments that we don't have time to experience right at that time?
Right. Yeah. Joan, I'm looking at the chat. I don't think there is a question yet, but maybe we can, while people who are on think of questions, do we want to do one poem each?
Sure, you go first.
Okay. and I'll just set. I was going to read initially a poem, another one from Woman by the Door, but I hope whoever's listening can try and get a copy and read for themselves. In light of what's happening in the world, I'm actually going to pick a poem from Shelling Peanuts and Stringing Words, and you'll understand why when I read it. It's an abecedarian, and it's called Epitaph, 26 Children of War. A, apple of our eyes, stay forever sweet. B, born to be a poem, you're rhyming 13 years. C, ceremonial colors in life, death richer red, dancing footsteps tiny free, glide across the azure sky. Even today she waits, warm muffin in hand. Freedom is now yours. You smile, toothless. Greeted by bullets, my womb became your casket. Hope you are somewhere kind. You deserved not a macabre dead. Eminent scholar boy, your books will await your turn. Just your little finger clasp preserves my breath. Keep your friends company, sing aloud in unison. Lofty goals did not save my child. I cannot forgive. Monstrous wails of your mother will miss you, angel. Never lose your crayons. Draw a clear blue sky, son. Only yesterday I bought you a kite. I buried it today. Put your head to the pillow. You deserve rest. Quote to the universe the hymn of a butterfly. Refugee child, you went to the sea. The ark set you free. Stringing sniper bombs was not how I planned your life. Theater to the world's script. You acted your part with a smile. Under a starless sky, I will look at you, my pole star. Veins overflow with terror. She still sings you a lullaby. Wiki returns blood in response. Wiki returns blood in response. Ukraine, your children we mourn. X-ray films show a dark shadow. Your tiny bones are already ash. You never learned to call me Baba. We taught you the syllables of war. Zara, Zara, you barely blossomed. The earth longed your scent. 26 Children of War, Epitaph. The poem was originally written for Syria. Doesn't matter, right?
Wow. I need to get a copy of that book.
I'll send you one.
I don't have the words, but that yeah, I just don't have the words. That That poem is incredible.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat, which is, where does your inspiration come from? What helps you both fuel your creativity when writing a poem? And I'm going to answer that question with a poem, because the poem that I chose is, I think, equal parts hope and sadness. And for me, because I work with children, I'm a teacher and I'm around kids all day long. And 12-year-olds, 11 and 12-year-olds don't let you take yourself seriously. So
that's a great point. Yes.
Grief is grief, and it's terrible. And I that first year used to spend bathroom breaks crying, between bells. But this poem talks about, I guess, like finding inspiration in who is still living. Mm-hmm. And that those moments where I'm not allowed to take things so seriously, it has a little bit of both of that. And this one is in Night Swim.
Okay.
Yes. From Diode Editions, and it's called Cobweb.
Waiting. Go ahead.
Cobweb. Sister, yesterday I spoke to the ER nurse about the day your son died. I asked her the question I'd wanted to ask for years. If we'd reached him sooner, gotten him to the hospital faster, would he have survived? She hesitated, said, it's really unlikely. And if he had lived, he would not have been the boy we knew. The boy who one winter built a snow fort for his sister's Barbies, refused to throw water balloons to avoid hurting anyone, swallowed his own suffering so no one would worry. If he had made it, he would have needed around-the-clock care, brain quiet, even as his heart continued beating. The nurse asked, would you consider that a life? Sister, remember how on the day he was born, his Mars red body cooled to pink in my arms, his veins like a network of questions connected, leading somewhere I could not see. In the parking lot at work today, the trees are solemn and unmoving, as though even the wind decided to take a bereavement day. Sparrows burst across the sky, chase each other in their ancient choreography of joy, their wingspan broadening his absence. Sister, at school today, the science teacher writes questions on giant Post-it notes around the classroom, and the students take turns answering questions like, what is a rainbow? What is gravity? In response to, what is a cobweb? One student writes, a mysterious string of silk, complex, strange and beautiful, so easily torn.
Wow.
That was Cobweb from Night Swim.
What a beautiful poem.
Thank you.
And yes, you're right. Hope and that sadness, and I keep coming back to distance, right? It's written after a while. I finally went to the ER nurse and asked the question that I've always wanted to ask. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Thank you for reading that.
Thank you. This has been amazing.
This has been great. I know we are at time. We'll probably wait for somebody to tell us to stop. Otherwise, we'll keep going. But thank you, Joan, for joining. I've like we just probably discovered there's a connection of a different kind here, and I wish you well, and I wish we get the chance to read again together as well.
Thank you. I would love that. And thank you again for the invitation, Kashiana. Your poems are beautiful and
You're an
necessary.
inspiration.
And
thank you.
Unfortunately, it is my job to tell y'all that it's time to stop, but this has truly been amazing. Thank you both so much for not only sharing your work with us, but allowing us this window into such a wonderful conversation. This is one of our first in the series of Poets in Conversation, having two people with such, as you've said, distinct poetic voices, but talking over your common ground, and you clearly are familiar with each other's work, I think was something really special. So thank you for allowing us to be part of that. Thank you to everyone who's joined us and is watching live in Zoom or on Facebook. And if you're watching this after the fact, thank you for watching as well. If you'd like more information on Joan and Kashiana's books, I have one of Kashiana's here, but the links to their websites are in the event description on our website, which is the-muse.org. And if you'd like to see more upcoming events, you can go to the Muse website as well. So again, thank you both so much. This has really been beautiful. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Have a good night.
Take care. Bye.